ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Dwight Skip Stackhouse.
Good evening. In December of 1987, James Baldwin died. I was not with him. I should have been. I do not even remember how I learned about his death. I just remember weeping uncontrollably, not unlike everyone who knew and loved him. I met James Baldwin in 1979, right here in the city of Detroit, actually at the Castle building, which at the time was just a hovel. It has since been refurbished and houses, among other things, the Republic restaurant. It was a great gift, and I will never forget it. How could I? He seems more popular now than when he lived. He was often called a prophet. And he is certainly as relevant now as he was at any point in his life. We gathered for rehearsals at the Castle building when I was a young actor with the Ira Aldrich Theater Company under the leadership of Walter Mason. And I was performing in one of Jimmy's plays, a piece called The Amen Corner. And Walter Mason, the director, knew James Baldwin, and he called him and announced that the play was being done, and he thought that Jimmy should change his schedule and come see this sterling production. He announced to us that Jimmy was coming, and of course we all got excited about the opportunity. But as an actor, I had heard this before. Some great star was coming, some well-known actor, and they were even going to share the stage with local actors. But Jimmy said yes. And all of the young aspirants thought we would get a little shine under the light of the great star. You know, back then we all thought we were the next Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Ossie Davis, Diane Carroll, etc. But sure enough, a couple of nights before opening, in strolled James Baldwin. He had a handsome young man with him who I assume was doing his bidding. I thought Jimmy was exotically beautiful. He was particularly effeminate. He was wearing one of those ambassador caps, and he had this scarf around his neck, which he would toss nervously and daintily into the air. My impression was that the other actors were intimidated, nervous as Jimmy himself was, until his kindness and affability softened them up a bit. We sat in a semicircle around him at what I considered an unfriendly distance, and I really wanted to hear from him, so I moved up, and I was essentially sitting alone between Jimmy and the rest of the cast behind me. Jimmy made some brief remarks and asked if there were any questions, and of course my hand flew up. And I asked about the play, which was experiencing a revival of sorts around the country at the time, and I was curious about the other companies that were putting it on. And this had the effect of opening everyone up, and we had a very nice exchange. Jimmy sat through the rehearsal of a scene or two, but before he left, there was some very obvious flirting going on with me. And he handed the director a note inviting me to a party that was being held that night and nearby. And I was like, well, did you tell him? I mean, you told him who I am, right? I mean, he knows I'm into women, right? And he said, yes, I told him, but he wants you to come anyway. Now, I really wanted to go. I was a bit anxious because I didn't want to be misleading, you know, the whole sexual disparity thing. As it turns out, I was the only straight man at the party. Yeah. And the party was held at the home of Clifford Fears. And for those of you who don't know or don't remember, Clifford Fears was a real fine artist in his own right. He was a Catherine Dunham dancer and choreographer. And when I got there, the music was blasting and the lights were low. I'm guessing now, but it seems to me there were about 20, 30 men there, all shiny, educated, and accomplished. This was back when everywhere I went, I was the youngest person in the room. Not so much anymore. But walking into the room, I got the distinct feeling of being a sexual object. Well, I mean, I would like to think that sexual object was among my traits when I was a young man. But I'd never had this kind of attention in a room full of men. It felt very much like a woman must feel in similar circumstances. But it was a great night. And it lasted all night. After the handshaking and introductions, some of the attendees wanted to read Jimmy plays and poems and essays and such. And then Jimmy and I found a corner of the room, and we sat down on the floor and had one of those getting to know you conversations. And we talked about many things, and we discovered we had many things in common. We were both, for example, mama's boys. We both had an abiding dislike of our fathers. And we chuckled at the irony of the fact that it was my father who introduced me to his work. We had both been young Christian ministers. We were both holding a certain rage at the state of race relations in the country. And we made much of the fact that neither of us was formally educated. And Jimmy talked about his honorary degrees and playfully suggested that we should start calling him Dr. Baldwin. And he laughed, that amazing laugh of his. And he held my hand and touched me tenderly throughout the night, which I did not resist. At the end of the night, there was the requisite hug, long and affectionate. But I'm sure you've all had a moment like this where you have to break the hug. You're not feeling it quite like the other person was. I've had that moment many times in my life, but never with a man in my arms. At some point during the night, Jimmy asked if I would consider going on the road with him, manage his affairs. Now, this was interesting, but improbable because I could not manage my own. I should mention that this all occurred during a horrible period in my life. I was a broken man. I was clinically depressed, having recently lost my mother, a story I documented in my first book called Mother's Milk. But to make the long story short, I said yes, and a wonderful ride began. We traveled the country and abroad. I met many of yesteryear's celebrities, Liz Taylor, Jackie Onassis, Marlon Brando, Maya Angelou, Lena Horne, and the great Nina Simone. And many, many others. I lived in his villa on the Côte d'Azur in the south of France for several months. The night I met Jackie Onassis, I want to say it was 1980, 1981, Jimmy, along with Philip Roth, Claire Bloom, and Bill Steinman, along with other literary giants, had been invited to the main branch of the New York Public Library to be honored. And Jimmy was so nervous. Here is a man of prodigious intellect, utterly accomplished, and he was all aflutter. He calmed down when the first literary giant he encountered was Bill Steinman. Now, Bill Steinman was the man, it is important to say, the white man who had had the audacity to write the novel The Confessions of Nat Turner in first person. Now, this is the story of a slave who staged a brutal insurrection in the 19th century. And Jimmy defended his right to do so, so a camaraderie developed between them. But he softened even more and relaxed when the lovely, sophisticated, and former First Lady Jackie Onassis arrived, with her date for the evening, Bill Blass, the fashion designer. She and Jimmy had had quite a relationship in the 60s around the civil rights movement, and there was real, genuine warmth between them. And talk about audacity. I walked right up to her and kissed her full on the lips. Yeah. I did say I was not well at the time. She didn't seem offended, but you know, a boy from 23rd Street. I have so many stories, so many moments where I felt lucky, gifted to be with this man, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. And what a ride it was. I went to New York and met his family and his agent, and eventually we flew to France to his private home, the villa, nestled in the historical village of Saint-Paul-de-Vence. His property and most of the structures there were older than America. I remember one night we were sitting on his veranda under the moonlight. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and we're all preparing to go to bed, and we hear somebody screaming, "Jimmy, get your ass up and fix me a goddamn drink." Nina Simone had arrived. Jimmy loved this woman, and of course we all wanted to hang out with her. You know, we're fans, but she wasn't having it. "Send them pretty motherfuckers to bed. We got to talk." She would not share Jimmy with anyone, not even with other stars. The truth is, all of the stars were that way. Bill Cosby, Simone Signoret, Bobby Short, Marlon Brando, they all wanted him to themselves. And of course we had to be all right with that. We had him the rest of the time. We would, if you will, sit at his feet hour after hour and through the night. And of course I got to travel to colleges and universities from Florida to Oregon, from Texas to Maine, during a 6-month college speaking tour. But when we were alone, just us, at Alfaro's, his favorite restaurant in the West Village, or the Russian Tea Room in New York, or the famed Colombe d'Or in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, it was, and Jimmy would not like to hear it said this way, but it really was like sitting with the master, the guru, This is a man who said to Dick Cavett, I think it was Dick Cavett, and they were talking about miscegenation and the legend of the irresistibility of the daughters of white men to black men. And Jimmy said, without missing a beat, you don't have a problem with black men sleeping with your daughters. We've been sleeping with your daughters all of our lives. It's your wife's daughters you don't want us sleeping with. And this created an uncomfortable pause. I think we were at the Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, and Jimmy had made some very provocative statements around the confusion of white identity in America. Exeter Academy is high school. And a young white boy stands up and haughtily asks, Mr. Baldwin, having so eloquently described the nature of the white man in America, how would you describe the black man here? And again, Jimmy said, without missing a beat, black is a cat whose mother raised you to lynch her sons. It's like Jimmy would just, make you stop and ponder. He would have you questioning your own perception, your own intellect. I remember one night we were talking about the insanity, again in Jimmy's terms, the insanity of people who thought of themselves as white and their treatment of everyone else. And Jimmy said, it's simple, really. It's impossible to forgive someone you know you have wronged. We were like, what? Jimmy, but say it another way. Make me understand that. And he would just say, think about it. Just think about it. I've been thinking about that for 35 years. There are so many moments to share about the gift he proved to be for me. Too many. But the moment that touched me the most happened when we were in Bowling Green. And Jimmy had finished a lecture and we were headed to our next adventure. And we were in the airport. Now this could not happen today, even in a small airport, but this actually occurred. Someone came running up to us, and this unnerved Jimmy because he knew he had angered people all across the country, and you never knew who was coming at you. And of course, part of my job was to protect him from the madness. Well, as it turns out, the young man was an employee of the airport, and he asked Jimmy to stop. He said, we'd even hold the plane. Now, that was important because Jimmy and I were often near to missing our flights. But the reason was that there was a woman in the airport who just wanted to meet him. Now, we thought that was particularly strange, but Jimmy's face lit up with that smile, and he agreed to pause. And we see sprinting down the corridor, insofar as you can sprint when you're in your 80s and dependent on a four-legged cane. This woman came running. When she arrived, she was out of breath and bent, as some of us get at a certain age. Bless you, son. She stood erect just long enough to reach up and touch his face. She gazed upon Jimmy like she was looking at an angel or an ancestor. They told me you was here, and I just had to get myself together so I could come down here and lay my hands on you. I'm gonna be all right now. I'm gonna be all right. You gonna be all right. And with that, she was satisfied. Jimmy wept about this moment, but there were so many moments like that, and all of them humbled Jimmy and awed me. But I'm really talking about having been gifted by love all of my stories are about love. And so are all of his. The great gift it is. I loved Jimmy Baldwin. Jimmy Baldwin loved me. Now, I know I'm not the only one who can say that. But I am one of the few people for whom James Baldwin wrote and dedicated a poem. The poem appears in his only collection of poems in a book called Jimmy's Blues. I am the skip in the title of one of the poems, A Song for Skip. I have the original copy, which he gave to me on his veranda in the south of France. When I met Jimmy, he gave me autographed copies of all of his published work. And I was with him when he researched and wrote most of the treatise on the Atlanta child's slayings, which became the book Evidence of Things Not Seen, his last book. And in the movie, I Am Not Your Negro, I was there in the background. And no offense to Samuel L. I should have been the narrator of that documentary. The poem is just an extension of the gift of this great man in my world. And I hope you get it, because I should have been with him when he died. He wrote to me in the aforementioned poem, I'm going to tell God how you treated me one of these days. I thought about that. I was living in Boston at the time. It had fallen on hard times, but I would have walked. This was when Eastern Airlines had the shuttle between Boston and New York. I borrowed some money. I made it to the funeral. Maya Angelou, Amiri Baraka, and others made their way to the microphone and eulogized Jimmy. The African drums reverberated in the cathedral of St. John's the Divine, and I had a tantrum. My mind was screaming, you should let me talk. They did not love him. They did not know him like I did. I was wrong, of course. Wrong in so many ways. As the hearse and the limos lined the streets, I saw David Baldwin, Jimmy's brother, sitting in one of them. His face and mine were swollen with tears. I approached the limo and knelt at the window and tried to say how sorry I was. But in his eyes, I saw. I want to be wrong about this, but I think I saw his eyes tell me to go away, be gone, that I had no right to be there. And this, of course, caused me to weep more profusely. They said Jimmy was an angry man. He was. But if you had seen what he saw, had you lived through what he lived through, you would be angry too. But I will tell you, he was as kind and gentle as he was intelligent. And yes, we loved each other. I do not know how many of us are left who knew him in that time, but I am here. So I guess it is true. Love never dies. Thank you.
Dwight Skip Stackhouse.